So what I'll do is I'll start off introducing our panelists. Liba Pichar to the right is an associate professor of conservation biology at CSU. Her research explores win-win opportunities for conservation and restoring biodiversity on working lands, as also sustaining human well-being. Her research addresses topics ranging from conservation of rare birds in island ecosystems and how to sustain the planet and animal communities in landscapes dominated by residential development. Her projects span Colorado, Hawaii, and New Zealand. She focuses on birds and mammals and pollinators. She's been a collaborator in the Fort Collins Nature and the City Biodiversity Project. And she's also teaches classes in conservation biology, ecology. And she said she feels lucky to work with an amazing group of graduate students. Very nice. Are your grad students here tonight? Okay, only one. Okay, so I guess the others are going to have some issues getting out. Let's go to Tim Broderick is the Sustainability Administrator for the Housing and Dining Services here at CSU. His work focuses on sustainability behavior and change, supporting peer-to-peer sustainability outreach among student populations on campus. He's an instructor at the School of Global Environmental Sustainability and teaches courses focused on engagement and applied sustainability. He's a member of the leadership team that helped CSU achieve the world's first sustainability tracking, assessment, and rating system platinum score. Tim has a degree in environmental sciences and studies from Townsend University and is a LEED AP certified existing buildings and operations. He's a recipient of the Division Student Affairs Innovation Award. He serves as co-chair of the NASPA Sustainability Knowledge Community. Before he was at CSU, Tim worked at Temple University. Welcome, Tim. Okay, all right. Give him a hand, that's okay. We'll talk. Lindsay X is our next panelist. Lindsay is a professional pioneer, pioneer and planner and public administrator. She's a pioneer too. She leads the implementation of the Climate Action Plan and goals for the city of Fort Collins. Over 70 staff members and almost 50 citizens on a regular basis. The Fort Collins Climate Leadership has been recognized through 2017 as winner of the C40 Cities and Bloomberg Philanthropic Award. Lindsay holds a master's degree in landscape architecture and environmental planning from Utah State University and a bachelor's degree in natural resource management from Oregon State. She currently serves as treasurer for the Sustainable Living Association and was recognized for her sustainability leadership in 2016 as a Northern Colorado 40 and an Under 40 Award. Congratulations, thank you. Okay, and finally, Patrick Keys. Somebody mixed up my cards. I had these in order. Sorry about that, Pat. Pat is a research scientist at SoGES. His research is focused on human dimensions and moisture cycling. In other words, how humans interact with the atmosphere. Prior to joining SoGES, Pat founded the environmental consultancy that worked on local and international partners exploring food security in the Middle East. He has conducted fieldwork around the world, and his degrees in sustainability science, water resources, and biology. Let's give our panel a hand for joining us tonight. Okay, so why don't we start off, Liba, why don't we start off with just some opening remarks, and then we'll circle back and we'll open it up for questions. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. Again, my name is Liba, and I'm on the faculty at CSU in the Warner College of Natural Resources. And I've lived at Fort Collins for about 10 years now and love this community. And so really excited to be able to talk about Fort Collins and its future tonight. I think I'm here in part because of my connection in collaboration with the City of Fort Collins' Nature in the City project, which I can talk a little bit more about as the night unfolds, but I'll just say a few things now. So this is a really exciting project that was actually launched primarily by Lindsay, who's now moved on to leading other programs with the city. But the idea is to really think about how we can continue to provide great access to urban open space to everybody in Fort Collins. So how can we provide great access for people? So within, say, a 10-minute walk from everywhere, from anyone's home as a walk rather than as the crow flies. So making nature accessible within the city of Fort Collins, which is mostly our everyday experience of nature, but also making these places rich environments for biodiversity, urban biodiversity. And so together with the city of Fort Collins, every year for the last 4 years, we've gone out and surveyed for birds and butterflies and plants across urban open space across the city. And by that, I mean everything from schools to natural areas and a private open space in neighborhoods. And the idea is to help this city then guide development and conservation decisions that are science-based, that are based on these surveys. And most recently, we've incorporated a strong citizen science component into these surveys. So many residents of Fort Collins join us every summer in collecting these data, which has been really exciting and rewarding for all of us. So I'll stop there.
Okay, Tim.
Hi, everyone. I brought some cheat sheets with me, so hold on. So besides being an instructor for the School of Global Environmental Sustainability, my full-time job is Assistant Director of Sustainability for Housing and Dining Services. My area of expertise and interest really is education and outreach. And I spent some time today dwelling on how does my role connect with this envisioning of the city, besides the collaboration points with the city of Fort Collins. And I think one of the really important pieces is my experiencing working with the next generation who will be the citizens of the city of Fort Collins. This CSU institution is a part of the foundational DNA of the city of Fort Collins. And our students are incredibly important. And I know statistically, and I brought some stats to share, with our students who live on campus through our Assessing Sustainable Cultural Survey, graduate students, PhD students, undergrad students, we know that 93% of them believe that sustainability is important to them. So as that generation comes out and feeds into influencing this visioning piece of what our city is going to be like, I firmly do believe that our vision is much brighter for the future maybe than where we have come because of the tools that they have. And that's a part of my responsibility, is to give them those tools and understanding that wider 30,000 foot view of sustainability.
So good evening, everyone. Again, I'm Lindsay X, and so thank you to SoGES for having me tonight, and Avos, and all of you guys for coming out. One of the things we're so blessed with in our community is just how engaged everyone is, and tonight is obviously no difference in that. I'm supposed to talk about why I'm on this panel tonight, and if you know me, one of the most important things in my life is that I'm a mom. I have two little daughters who are about to turn 3, so yes, they're twins, and if we were allowed to use slides, I would be shamelessly promoting them, because they just are the light of my life, and similar to what Tim mentioned, the future of our community. In addition, I'm a resident of Fort Collins as well in the area, but I think the real reason I'm here is because I work for the city of Fort Collins. And I spent my first 5 years with the city in the planning department, doing a lot of development review work. So every single development project that happened in Fort Collins, my eyes were on it as the environmental planner. I also, as Leva mentioned, got to start up the Nature in the City project, as well as lead our initial code and policy work around urban agriculture in our community. And for the past 3 years, I've been in our sustainability department, leading up our work around climate action, and just most recently have joined the core team for our city planning efforts, which is really looking out for the next 25 to 30 years for what our community wants to be like. And just this past week, I had a chance to be in a conversation with our city leadership about what are we really going to have our community look like? And one of the most important conversations that we had, in my opinion, is around how we can remain a friendly community, and how do we really maintain that small town feel as our secret sauce here in Fort Collins. So I'm really excited about this topic and conversation tonight. And as a confession, this is actually my first time at one of these panels. So I'm really excited to learn from you all about how this works. Oh, and a second confession. Leba actually gave me my first job in Fort Collins, so I'm very excited to be on the panel with her as well.
Yeah, thanks everybody for being here tonight. And I'm also a resident, and I would also be shamelessly plugging my son if I were up here to say, look at this future resident, isn't he adorable? And because he is. And I think I've lived here for 5 years now, and when I think about that, that's a little crazy. That's the longest I've lived anywhere in a long time. And so when I reflect on what it means to be a resident and kind of thinking about sustainability in a place that I plan on living for much longer, I think that's an interesting question. And so when I saw the title of this, Managing the Planet, I sort of had several questions that arose in my own mind that I'm going to kind of throw out to the audience to kind of maybe some provocations. And so the first one is, it's envisioning our future city. Will we still love it? Who is we? So when we read that sign, what are we thinking about when we envision what we is in the future? The future is going to look different. It's going to look different demographically. We're going to have different age distribution, different ethnicities represented. I think that's important to think about what does that mean when we're thinking about a future like that. And another big thing that I think about a lot is how technology changes us as a society and as people. And so in the future, I mean, our broadband network is going to seem old in the future, 30 years from now, hopefully, right? And we're going to have driverless cars. We're going to have lots of things that are very different from what they are now. So how's that going to affect us and how we see ourselves? And I'll just kind of leave it at that. I could go on, but we'll do that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, is that better? There we go. Anybody want to open up with the first question for the panel? Yes. Okay, come on up here, or come closer so I can hand you the mic. And you have to tell us your name.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Eunice. I've lived here for 30 years. I'm so excited to watch how we grow. I'm involved in as many groups as I have time for. I work with Lindsay. I'm on the new Boards and Commissions Futures Committee, a small group who's trying to plan 50 years into the future, and my dream is that we'll go 7 generations and work on some things like a wisdom council, which you guys all are just great examples of. Where we can consider everything, all of us, and how do we go forward from here and help save the planet in ways that are convenient and that we can work with each other and transition into the different jobs that are going to be appearing and the jobs that need to go away so that we can make this planet habitable and healthier and be the shining example that Fort Collins is. We have this unique family kind of feel. It does still feel like a small town. I've been here 30 years. It was 80,000. It's 164 now, right? Police count. It still feels like family. So I'm excited. I'm going to shamelessly plug on Earth Day, April 22nd. We're going to be here. It's an initiative, a statute, for those of you who know about 71, which is Greek to those of you who don't. Most of it's been overturned. And we're putting a statute out. We're going to need petitioners, signatures. It's a 2,500-foot setback for fracking from homes, from inhabited buildings like schools, and we're already seeing that going in right next to schools, from hospitals, from recreation areas, and from water sources. A 2,500-foot setback it's a baby step. It's something that's achievable, and we're going to need people to just step up and do anything, throw $5 in, just come and rah-rah with us, you know? Because we have some good music, and it's Earth Day, and we're going to celebrate and plan together and figure out how to make it better for the Earth. And that's my shameless plug. From 3 to 5. The question is, can I get all your information? Yeah, there was a question. Can I get your information, like your card, so I can be in touch with you for future stuff? I do a lot of events. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. Okay, well, actually, let me follow up on something she pointed out. I don't want to date myself. I've been here about 30 to 40 years. We've tripled the population. So as a city employee, how have we done? I mean, how is the city, I mean, what's the narrative we have has Fort Collins done a good job with this growth? And is that the city mantra, or what do you hear from citizens? Like, are we doing good with planning for growth? And
one of my favorite things that people like to say about Fort Collins is we're a 50-50 community. And so very much like people's emotions around prairie dogs, you can hear ideas all across the spectrum. I think when we look at our policies, they're very focused on that establishment of a growth management area, infill and redevelopment around that growth management area, and really focusing on how we maintain quality of life. Now, there's a ton of challenges within that bigger policy statement, and I'm sure we're going to be diving into those tonight. But this is one of the reasons within our city planning process why we're really focused on issues around jobs and housing and transportation issues and how we're going to achieve our climate action goals within all of that. How do we really begin to think about equity? So all of those things have not been without their challenges.
Okay, anybody else? Good.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just read this article in the High Country News. Many of you probably saw it, about how Fort Collins probably grew too fast. Maybe we grew too fast. And as a very recent arrival, I guess you could say, compared to many who've already spoken, I actually feel like this is an amazing community. I've lived in some bigger cities all over the place, and it's just tremendous how much this place is able to kind of pack in terms of diversity, culture, life. Friendliness is off the charts. And so I think for those of you that read that article and maybe it resonated in different ways, I think reflecting on what's our context, what's our frame of reference for comparing what our ideal community is, and that we're always on a trajectory towards something else. We're not going to ever freeze in time. So thinking about what you're comparing it with, I think, can be useful. And for me, it's been a very favorable comparison. So.
Okay, question. You don't want me asking questions all night. I got like 100 of them, so there we go. Thank you. There we go.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a student at Front Range Community College. I think it's great how the city is implementing nature in the city. I'm from Los Angeles, so I definitely know how it is to grow up without having access to nature. My question for you, the panel, is how will you be implementing the stewardship within the citizens and within the community members in order to want to protect the environments that are being implemented and just basically protecting the earth that we live on and the community that we live in? Thank you.
Great. Liba, maybe handle
Yeah,
that one.
I can start, and then
Okay, there we
others
go.
can jump in. Yeah, so that's a great question, and a really important one, right? Is that we all hopefully have some sort of stewardship ethic here in Fort Collins, and that's a strong focus of the Nature in the City initiative, is to recognize that a lot of people care about local open space, and the way that they experience nature on a daily basis might be on a bike ride to work, or walking their dog along a ditch, or hanging out with their kids at a playground at a local school. And so there's several different ways that Nature in the City is engaging with communities and trying to help facilitate stewardship. And one is the Citizen Science Project that I mentioned, but another is that the program has some small grants available, competitive grants for neighborhoods or groups of people to apply to do a stewardship project in their local community within Fort Collins, so in their neighborhood or at their local school, where they could help restore, say, native plant communities or plant and animal communities, to provide a really nice patch of nature, enhance sort of the assets of their community. So that's, if you're not familiar with that program, if you're interested, feel free to talk to me afterwards, and I can connect you to the people that run that program. But I think that's one great way that that the city of Fort Collins is engaging communities in stewardship.
Okay. Any other follow-ups?
I think just to build on that a little bit, from my lens of working with sort of first-year students at CSU, there is this idea we can build these incredible natural spaces and open spaces, but then how do we get our students to actually use them? And I think having that conversation is very difficult. And I think you have to be open from every different direction. We have students who come from Kansas and Nebraska, and their experience of being in the outdoors or using these open spaces is going to be drastically different from our students who come from Washington and Oregon. And I think we have to be able to mold our value set and be willing to change for our citizens of the future as we create these open spaces, and to make sure they're used in the way that we want them to be used.
Okay. Anybody else? Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, just from the kind of academic perspective, one of my favorite definitions of what stewardship is imagine a Venn diagram with 3 circles that overlap. And one of those circles is knowledge, one of those circles is agency, and one of those circles is care. So knowledge is the kind of information about the landscape, how things work together in an ecosystem. Agency would be kind of the feeling or the ability that you can do something about that. And then care would be the desire to do something, that you care about your place that you live in. And so I think one way to also strengthen stewardship is to kind of recognize that different parts of Fort Collins, for example, are going to need to be kind of encouraged on different aspects of that. Some places have a lot of agency, maybe not as much knowledge, or maybe some places have a lot of care, but not as much agency. And so figuring out which part of that kind of overlapping, very simplified system you need to kind of empower might be another key to unlocking stewardship in various parts of the community.
Okay, I have a question back here.
Hi, thanks. I I moved here to Fort Collins because I love Fort Collins and all the progressive work that we do here in the city. But I wonder if you guys can speak to any potential examples as we continue to grow, how Fort Collins can be an example regionally. Greeley is the third fastest growing community in the United States right now, and a lot of people are coming to the area. Is there any lessons learned that we could potentially scale up to some of our neighboring communities?
Okay. There we go.
This is actually me holding back by not answering the last question,
Okay.
so happy to take the lead. So many thoughts. I think on the sustainability front, one of the things I'm really proud that Fort Collins is a part of is some of the broader organizations that we're engaged with. And so some of you know that we are a part of what's called Colorado Communities for Climate Action, which is focused on state level policy advocacy around the actions that we all can't influence just as local governments. And I'm also really excited about another recent statewide group. It's called the Compact of Colorado Communities, which is focused still on climate action, but also around community resiliency at a broader level. And I had a really great opportunity to visit with the town manager of Craig back in January, talking with him about, their community is never going to join a group like CC4CA, the policy advocacy group, but they still want the tools that some other communities are working on, just like Fort Collins. And so we were able to talk about how they are working on resiliency up in Craig. So it's not specific to that work more regionally here. Through City Plan, we are definitely talking with regionally, how do we really think about some of our transportation challenges? Because we have about 60,000 folks that commute in and out of Fort Collins. And those implications are big on housing. Those implications are big on whether or not we can reach some of our broader sustainability goals too. So there's a lot of movement around that right now too.
So you talked to the city managers of Greeley and Loveland, and you guys are your plans coalesced? Like, in other words, it seems like what Loveland would do would impact Fort Collins in terms of, like green space or whatever. So there is that sort of dialogue that goes on between the cities.
There's really strong collaboration on the open space front with the communities in Larimer County, absolutely. And then we are one of 4 member communities with Platte River Power Authority, and I think that there are some sea changes that we're seeing within those bigger choices that are being made at a utility scale around our energy future.
Okay, question.
Hi, my name is Eleanor. One of you mentioned that the city should be walkable, and I noticed this is really kind of maybe minor, but is there any plans for children to walk to school? I don't see any of the kids in my neighborhood walking, and their parents are driving them out every morning. Can you make a definite effort to try to make it so the kids can walk to school?
Okay.
Define school. At the university, the vast majority of our students walk to class. So elementary, middle, those alternative.
Gosh, there's so much to unpack there. And my children aren't even school age yet, but we've got a lot of things that are amazing about our schools in Fort Collins, and one of that is school of choice, right? And so I know as we're thinking about where my kids are going to go, of course it would be so nice for them to just go to the local elementary, but what about the experience that some of these other schools offer? And yes, that would mean that I'm driving. So I think that our parents are faced with a lot of challenging questions that they need to address as they're choosing where their kids go to school to begin with. Now, if it is possible for them to just walk to school, the city certainly supports programs like Safe Routes to School and others that really helps kids and parents get across some of those challenging crossings. So there's a lot to unpack in that question, but we're certainly working on that from an educational perspective, as well as just trying to make it safer too when you do choose that.
Okay, Pat.
Yeah, and just to chime in, I'm very fortunate that I live within walking distance of my son's daycare. So we can walk to school or walk to daycare every day and walk home. I think that a big hurdle is kind of the challenges of modern parenting are often that both parents are working because they have to. And then often, even in my neighborhood school, even for an elementary school, which is an even smaller area, it's still very far away. So it would even be a stretch to say that I could bike my son to school when it gets to elementary school time. And so I think both where schools are located, which probably isn't going to change anytime soon, but thinking about what are the kind of strategies. Maybe we won't get to walking just because the distance and the timing doesn't work out with everybody's schedules, but maybe you can come up with better bike routes or safe bike routes that would encourage people to do that, because if you're crossing roads, for example, and some of those things can actually be very dangerous. And so.
Okay, Lee.
Can I pipe in real
Yeah.
quick? So I felt really lucky to have the opportunity to spend 6 months in Sweden last year, and I've got 2 school-age children that are 6 and 8. And what I found so wonderful about this community that I lived in Sweden is that there is dedicated walking and biking lanes on every street, so separate places for people to walk and people to bike, and it was separated with a barrier from the roads. And so it just felt really safe and accessible for everyone, because I have friends who would like to bike their kids to school but don't, because they don't feel safe biking on streets with cars, sharing the road with cars, you know. And so yeah, I think there's lots of potential to improve our community, to provide better access for everyone who might have different thresholds for feeling comfortable sharing the road with cars. So I think it's a great point and a great question.
Okay. Question over here, and then.
Hi, I'm John Calderoso, retired English professor at CSU, writer, climate activist, and I volunteer for the city in Lindsay's great program. The question I have is, every time I drive around the city, a new part of the city, I see a new housing development. Sometimes they're really big. Every time I go back to campus, there's boom, a new building. It seems to be speeding up, and it's infill, you know. Every time I see a housing development, I expect to see solar panels. I don't always see them. And so I'm wondering, with the university and with town, could you describe, as you see it, the differences in what's required or what actually is mostly happening between, let's say, new building now and what might have happened 10 years ago or 15 years ago, that which is visible and that which is not?
Okay, good question.
I can take the city,
Sure.
and yes, everybody out there who works with me is a mole. I've planted all their questions. No, I'm just kidding. But this actually does bring up one of my favorite sayings that my energy services manager says, is that it's about eating your efficiency vegetables before you eat your renewable dessert. And so what we are really focused on from a land use code perspective, and that really outlines a lot of the requirements around what we're doing, is making our buildings more efficient first. In addition, in our code requirements, we have standards around homes being both solar ready, so that you have the option to do it, as well as orientation of the development to really maximize passive solar opportunities as well. So I think that's some of the big thing that you've seen, and I think that if I remember the statistics right, I know that I could pull them out, but that our homes are getting bigger, but their footprint from an energy perspective is getting a lot smaller. And so, are we perfect yet? No. Are we heading in that direction? You bet.
Oh, great. Tim.
From the university lens, I'm 10 years back made me think to go to 2008 in that time period. And I think for the residence halls, housing and dining services, and the apartments, that was when we had built our first LEED building at that time. It has now become a standard for the university that buildings built with state funding will be a LEED Gold minimum. As well, even university buildings built in auxiliaries try to target that. They want to hold that same standard. And so when we think about our sustainable buildings, the renewable energies are just one piece of that puzzle, a very important piece of that puzzle nonetheless. And we see that as LEED versions are changing, the weight towards sort of the energy and atmosphere credits are getting more heavy. And so we, very similar, build all of our new construction to be solar ready. And we do that with the intention of looking at sort of bulk buying. And that goes back to that price point of trying to keep our housing affordable for our students. And we've been able to get solar on 3 of our residence halls all at once through that bulk purchase, with a number of other installations across the entire university. That plays a factor with feed-in tariffs that are coming from the city. But even beyond just renewable energy, we're looking at materials and resources. We're looking at waste management practices in those buildings. We're looking at VOC and chemicals that are being used, green cleaning in those building complexes, purchasing, really every facet of how that building will operate as a part of what we do, as well as deconstruction. in those areas where we're going and we're tearing down like the Laurie Apartments that used to be there and is now Laurel Village, we diverted over 90% of those materials from the landfill. So we really look at that full cycle from start to end with an economic lens at the same time as to what can we do within our budget that's not a burden to the students.
Okay, question over here.
Yeah, good evening. Kevin Henry with the Fort Collins Sustainability Group. And I have a plug before my question, which is, as a part of this year's ACT Human Rights Film Festival, which is just getting underway, there's a screening of a film called Anote's Ark on Sunday at the Lincoln Center. It's the story of the island of Kiribati and the threats that climate change poses to that island as told by the former president. So the screening is at 4 o'clock. I'll be moderating a panel for Q&A that has Jackie Kozak-Teal from the City of Fort Collins Sustainability Office and also Scott Denning from the College of Atmospheric Sciences. So just encourage everyone interested to attend. My question kind of builds on the last and is directed again a bit more at Lindsay and Tim. And it relates to climate action and the very ambitious goals that the city has set, 20% reduction by 2020, 80% by 2030. Also the fact that CSU is committed to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. So to meet those goals, obviously we have to move faster even than we've been moving. And I would just like both to comment a little from a university and a city perspective, particularly in the area of renewable energy, which is going to be key to achieving those greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, since 50% of our footprint is from electricity, and then also waste and waste reduction and the road to zero waste. So I'd like to hear a bit both from the university and the city on opportunities and challenges.
Let's go. Tim?
So it's exciting to me that those plans are in place. Like that is the first step that gives us the authority to then move forward. There's so many other areas of sustainability where I wish those plans were in place. Someone mentioned coming to campus and there's always construction. And that is one of our biggest challenges. We increase square footage of our campus every single year. And that directly correlates to an increase in utility consumption. We have on the other side of the coin our climate action plan, as you referenced, and our 100% renewable electricity by 2030. And so it is a multi-layered approach as to how we're going to get there. Stacy Bumgarn, who's in the crowd, I wish I could turn the mic over. He's our energy coordinator for the campus. This is not my area of expertise, but I'll try to speak to it to the best of my ability. Carol Dollard and Stacy are working actively to transition on a large scale, because we know it can't happen on main campus, to get us renewable energy in wind or solar that will feed directly into the grid within the city of Fort Collins, which then comes to CSU as one of our main means of getting to that goal or that target. I think at the same time, it's my responsibility to engage our students on behavior. That's a really, really big piece of the puzzle. We need our students to take efficient lifestyle choices that they're going to then carry on as they move out of the university and into our community as a whole. And as well, we're doing our energy efficiency and on-campus projects and small-scale renewable energy projects at the same time when the right point arises to tackle those issues. Waste management, we're actively working on it as well. I was lucky enough when I came on in 2011 to CSU, one of the first projects that was handed to me was an in-vessel 30-yard composting system. It was one of the first in the nation that a university had decided we're going to create a composting program that's a part of our campus. And from there, it has unfolded in many different ways. The students brought forward a vote through ASCSU to fund an expansion of that about 2.5 years ago. We're now working with the Laurie Student Center. We're now working with the new stadium on campus. Academic buildings are coming to the table. And we know within the dining centers, with the new renovation project at Corbett Parmalee, when that's done, we'll have 100% food waste diversion of pre and post consumer coming out of our dining centers on campus, which is incredible for a place that serves 12 to 15,000 meals per day. And so hopefully our lessons can be shared with the city and the school district and all those other places. But it is a long road. It's a challenging road. Every year we learn something new and a different door and opportunity opens up for us. It's possible by the time we get to 2050, Elon Musk may have invented some brand new nuclear technology or something along those lines that solves all of our problems. Yeah, you may have gone bankrupt too. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Lindsay.
So thanks for that question. And I think, so I started in this role back in 2015, and I remember thinking, gosh, 2020 seems so far away. And now it doesn't feel as far away anymore. But one of the things that I've learned in the 3 years of being in this role is that what was aspirational even just 3 years ago is operational today. And just the sea change that we are seeing in this space just continues to blow me away. And it starts out with little things like Platte River that I mentioned earlier, changing their mission statement from lowest cost to cost effective, how that has changed the way that we're looking at some of these systems. Elections locally have changed the way that we are operating. And I think one of the things that we've seen in some of that space, I'll speak to the renewable electricity piece, is that nobody could have anticipated back in 2015 that a purchase of 150 megawatts of wind could essentially be long-term cost neutral to the work that we're doing. And that, gosh, there might be an opportunity for 75 more that our customers, from a utilities perspective, could potentially take advantage of. And to put it in perspective, you guys all know that solar, because I didn't used to speak megawatt and kilowatt before I was in this role. To put it in perspective, the solar garden that you see out at Riverside in Mulberry, that's about a half of a megawatt. It's a little bit more than that if you want to get prescriptive. It's 650, I think. But so imagine 150 megawatts. So imagine 300 of those at Riverside being just as cost effective as operating some of our resources today. Nobody could have anticipated that. And so I think that there is a lot of power in setting the carbon neutral goals that we have set as a community and how that has been a real catalyst. I've heard the executive director for the Innisphere talk about how it's allowed them to be more focused on the businesses that they're recruiting into Fort Collins because we've set these goals. So I think in just 3 years what I've learned is that we really can't anticipate all of the new technologies and systems and social opportunities that we have to advance some of these goals in a really pragmatic and cost-effective way. And I think on the waste side, we've got some really equal challenges there with our landfill set to close in 2025. Some of the policies that are coming down from China, we've got some really hard things to work through. But again, I think with the folks in this room tonight and the really smart folks that we have in Fort Collins, we are really well poised to solve some of those challenges.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Hi, I'm Miko Jimenez, and I'm a graduate student at CSU in the ecology program. And before my question, I just want to give a quick plug. Lindsay and Liba both kind of talked a little bit about the Nature in the City program. And I'm actually coordinating the citizen science portion of that program. So, you know, like I said, they talked about it a little bit, but I'm just going to talk about it again really briefly. Basically, you know, the natural areas in Fort Collins are one of my favorite things about Fort Collins. And in order to kind of protect them, we have to understand the diversity that's going, you know, that's within, you know, the city and how it's distributed. So as part of our program, we have citizen scientists go out and collect data for us on how that, you know, diversity, birds and butterflies are distributed across the city. And, you know, you get trained on how to conduct a point count, and we go out with you, and you get a cool T-shirt. So yeah, if you're interested in that, please just come talk to me. I have some flyers and stuff. So that's my plug. I also have a question about, so I think as Fort Collins grows, we can kind of expect, you know, introduced diversity and kind of, you know, value systems and opinions and perspectives. And while I think that's great, obviously, I think that also comes with some difficulties. And I was just wondering how, you know, the city's perspective on that and how we're equipped to deal with it, I guess.
Okay, Lindsay?
You're really right about that. And I think, you know, one thing that I think many of us in the room, we've talked about this. This is, I mean, if you ask me what my favorite thing about Fort Collins is, natural areas would be up there, but the friendly nature of this community is my number one. What I've learned as I've talked to folks in Fort Collins who maybe don't look just like me, or aren't my age, or don't share some of my own demographics or my history, is that it doesn't always feel the same way to them. And I think what I would say is we've got a lot of listening to do as a community to really think about how other people feel in Fort Collins, what their goals are. And I think the one thing that we've done as a community is really be adaptive to some of those changing needs. And so what was a priority a few years ago can shift, right? Because we can be adaptive and we can be nimble, and that's part of our DNA too. So.
Okay, Pat.
Just to add their kind of anecdotal perspective, I live right next to the Spring Creek Trail, and so I shouldn't have told you that. Now you know. But I'm on there all the time, and that's where I walk my son to school, and we walk around like the creek, and we just walk everywhere. And but what I love about Fort Collins, which is different than a lot of places I've lived, is that, for example, everybody bikes. I've seen every shape, every age, everybody bikes. And I think that's uncommon to a lot of communities, especially ones that are this big and that are growing, and with a university nearby. And so I think there, as an example of like biking trails and biking in Fort Collins is a platform, to think about it that way, for engaging a lot of different kinds of people. Because for whatever reason, everybody likes doing it here. It's not too, people aren't going too fast, they're not training, whatever, it's working. And so finding those platforms that are kind of emblematic of something that everybody is using, demographically, politically, whatever, might be an entry point for figuring out how can we continue to have a dialogue. As we have this growing diversity of opinions and perspectives, bike trails might be one of them, surprisingly, which isn't going to be true in every community. So finding what are some of those other things that can be platforms for dialogue to ensure kind of a friendly, continued, amazingly friendly place.
Okay, question back here.
Hi, thanks very much to the panel. I have a question that kind of thinks a little bit in the future about things that I see from other places, particularly Southern California, which when I first arrived in Southern California to do my research, I saw individual cities up and down the freeway that 20 years later turned into be just one massive city as LA grew. But what grew with it was fires, because there was unlimited growth into the hills. And now I look to our communities from Denver here, and with the growth of Fort Collins, I'm wondering how much we consider whether we will have more fires, the prevalence of fires, floods. What is the interaction here to think about this as a region, and what kind of quote-unquote disasters we may cause by moving in with unlimited growth into the hills around us.
Right.
Were you going to introduce yourself now?
That's the old Fort Pueblo questions, right? Fort Pueblo.
Yeah.
So
I think one thing that we can, you've heard the saying, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And I think one of the things we can really be thankful to our community members that came before us is some of the policies around community separators. So now you don't see it when you're on I-25 as much, but when if you're going down Shields or Taft, ideally by bus, right? You do get that sense of having a separator. So we are trying to think about how we stay unique in Fort Collins in that way. In addition, the resiliency and adaptation and climate impacts work is something that, while we have been working on that as a city, is something that you'll see this if you read the Trends and Forces report around city plan. You see this in, I believe, staff thinking right now, something we need to spend more time on. and put more resources into. And as if you guys want to dork out and look at our budgeting process in this coming year, you're going to see some information in there about that to explicitly look at that more. But absolutely, I mean, when we talk about climate mitigation, we're talking about largely about energy, waste, and transportation. When we're thinking about resiliency, boy, does water become a big part of the picture at that point, because one of our greatest challenges are around extreme heat. And how is that going to change the water availability? And then you combine extreme heat and drought and water, lack of water, and absolutely wildfire becomes one of the bigger threats as well. And I don't know how many folks in the room know this, but 1 in 4 of our residents in Fort Collins in our homes experience some type of a respiratory ailment. And we're also one of only 14 counties in the entire country that are projected to not meet the ozone standards. So we've got some real local and sort of broader regional issues around ozone that we have to really be thinking about for our most vulnerable populations when we're thinking about some of the climate impacts. It's a space we're really beginning in, and so a lot more work to come.
Patrick, good.
Before I came to SoGES, I wore a different hat as a consultant and did some work with the city around extreme heat, wildfire risk, climate mitigation, climate change mitigation. And one of the things that we found while working on the extreme heat and wildfire risk issue was that it was utterly integrated. So when you think about how we have extreme heat, well, then everybody's cranking up their AC, which is its own problem in terms of energy usage. And then when we had the big wildfire in 2012, associated with the extreme heat episode, a lot of air conditioning units actually clogged up because of the ash. And so when we think about these kind of inflection points in our community in terms of really big severe impacts that we tell stories about, like the 1997 flood or something like that, they're also associated with these kind of nexus events, these nexus of different hazards that kind of couple together to create much larger consequences than we would have expected otherwise. And so I think when we're thinking about climate adaptation, we also really need to think about kind of extremes and how those extremes interact with one another and create not perfect storms, but maybe perfect storms of consequences for the city, for us, because that's, I think, when we're going to really feel it, is when these things start to interact with one another, and it's gonna get hot.
Okay, question over here.
Hi, I'm Melissa McHale, and I am an urban ecologist at CSU. I'm in the Warner College, and I love being here to listen to this great panel. I did my PhD here as well, and I had to leave for 10 years. And every day for those 10 years, I just wanted to be back here. And so I'm really happy to be back in this past year working with the community again, towards thinking about how cities can be the answer to a sustainable future, which I truly believe that Fort Collins is going to be the biggest leader in the world in terms of those efforts because of the great things that the city and the university does, as these people are exemplary of. And I know that we can answer our challenges. We can think about the trade-offs that Lindsay just brought up in terms of water and carbon and environments that people feel healthy in and thrive in. What keeps me up every night, and I know this isn't a fair question, so I'm sorry to do this to you, is the affordability of living in this place. And that's just the one thing I can't get my head around, and I'm wondering what your ideas are on that.
Okay. That's a good one.
So the university struggles with this. It is an issue that is high on our list in terms of sustainability efforts, gets into sort of that social justice wedge of sustainability. Just to kind of share an example, CU, the city of Boulder, the majority of staff there commute in from outside the city limits. We've been lucky enough in the city of Fort Collins that has not been the case. The majority of our staff and faculty are able to come in within the city limits. I do think that's something that's going to potentially shift in the near future. And that's something we have to be having those hard conversations about. When we look at the salary of our staff, one of the areas that we use as our sort of benchmarking is the MIT livable wage. And we are striving to the best of our ability as fast as we possibly can to make sure that all of our staff members who are at the university are making a livable wage for the city of Fort Collins, and that they can afford to live within this community. Now, it'll be their choice at the end of that. Do they want to go to Greeley because the quality of life is more affordable there, even further beyond? Or do they want to go to Loveland? And that's a big piece of this puzzle that we have to be having this conversation about.
Okay. Lindsay, do you want to add anything, or do you want to move on?
It's really up to you. I think we all know this in the room, right? This is one of our greatest challenges right now
Right.
as a community, and we're not alone. This
Right.
is not a Fort Collins only challenge. I think there's a lot of work to be done in this space, and this is one of the reasons why it's our focus, one of our focus areas for City Plan.
Yeah, I mean, I lived out in Boulder, and when you take the Flex bus from Boulder to Fort Collins, you see the line of cars coming in, and it's everybody that works in the city. I mean, that's not university people. That's people that work at the Safeways and King Soopers, and there's a long way to travel. So let me the narrative we keep hearing is growth, and you talked about the quality, the cost of a quality of life. Well, who's benefiting from growth? Like, what is growth about? Is that when we say growth, does everybody benefit from growth, or does the city benefit because we have more taxes, or what? How do you wrap your head around that problem of growth? Is growth the best thing? I mean, is it good? Growth is good?
Well, maybe I'll reframe it back at y'all.
Okay.
How many of you moved here? Right? I did. So growth is good for my family.
Right.
And so I think I think that there absolutely are policies in place around growth paying its own way.
Right.
And that's a very important piece of the pie, and happy to go into the really awesome details about that, especially with the beer after this. But I think that, it's what we really talked about is how do we balance out growth with some of our quality of life values as a community.
Right.
And I think what we're trying to figure out is how do we be an and community, right? Where it can be growth and the triple bottom line.
Right.
Growth and, right?
Mhm.
So.
All right. Okay, question here.
Thank you. Speaking of Boulder, I came all the way from Boulder. I'm Susan Moran, a journalist based in Boulder. First to plug, I guess I can officially make it today. Thanks to this woman who needs no introduction, Diana Wall, and others. I'm on the board of the Society of Environmental Journalists, and we're going to bring a big conference here in 2019 in October, partnering with CSU and the city, and I'm sure plenty of others, but really it's thanks to Diana Wall and others who've been supportive, and just today the contract was signed, so really excited about that. So you'll be hearing a lot more. So the question, I just wanted to follow up on, was it Kevin or Henry's question about the climate action plan? Could you give a little more detail about how are you guys actually doing here? I know when Boulder started, I think in 2008, it changed not the baseline, but the targets a bit, because with growth comes all these sort of moving targets. And it's not that it's failing, but it does keep sort of transparently, sort of not transparently, sort of moving the target. And I'm wondering, how are you guys faring? How actually are you doing? And how do you incorporate growth as it is in your, not just your estimates, but your sense of actually, how can we get where we want to go?
So thank you. And as Kevin mentioned, our goals around climate action are to reduce our emissions below 2005 levels, 20% by 2020, 80% by 2030. Oftentimes you hear 80 by 50. That's where most of our peers are going. Our aim is to get there 2 decades before the rest of our peer cities, and to be carbon neutral by 2050. So even while we've been growing, we've actually gone even further with our goals. Our goals used to be 80 by 50. And I speak a lot about an engaged community, and have to give credit to Fort Collins Sustainability Group, because we actually established our first climate action goals back in 1999, and that was really a grassroots movement that they led. So we've been working on this for almost 20 years now as a community. As far as results go, our most recent inventory showed us at over halfway to our 2020 goals, and as Kevin has heard me say, I'm very optimistic that our next inventory we'll keep heading in the right direction. I got a text on another piece of data that I need tonight to help continue in that right direction. And Melissa mentioned what keeps her up at night, and what keeps me up at night is that 2030 goal. what kind of transformations do we really need to make as a community to reduce our emissions by 80% below 2005 levels? And electricity absolutely is a piece of that. So is natural gas. That's an area that we see increasing use. So I mentioned the budgeting process. We're going to be thinking about how do we really start cracking some of those nuts. And the city plan and transportation master plan, gosh, it's really hard for us to think 30 years out in that way. Of course, not at this event, right? But this is some of these spaces, when we're talking with cities from around the globe about what their greatest challenges are, how do we reduce our emissions in transportation? Folks don't know how to do that yet. So we've got a lot of work to do. We've done better on a per capita basis, so we're about 28% below our emissions from 2005 when you look at per capita. But our goals are overall community. So we're looking at being carbon neutral by 2050 in Fort Collins.
Okay, Kevin, you had a question?
It's just a follow-up to Jean's point, because I think growth is the elephant in the room. And the bigger question is, what are the limits of growth in the Front Range and in Fort Collins, which is a semi-arid area, highly dependent on water resources, even from the other side of the Rockies, transboundary water from the Colorado River. What are the limits to growth? And then layer on climate change, to that, increased average temperatures, impacts on snow, accumulation and melt and all of that. So I think growth is the elephant in the room, and the city is projecting, I think, 250,000 population. Once we have the build out of the growth management area, we're 160 something, 170 now already. So we have a lot of growth still to come, and is that sustainable? And that goes all the way up and down the Front Range. It's pretty much the same situation.
Go ahead, Patrick.
So I think one of the things is we are all using this word "we," and I think something that's kind of invisible is that we're assuming that we're all represented here, and we're what counts, maybe. And I'm not trying to put words in other. This is what I think often, and I forget that there are 80,000 people that are part of that "we" that aren't here yet, and so. Like you said earlier, we need to consider the diversity of opinions, but I also think we might need to sort of check some of our expectations at the door and say, maybe growth is a gigantic elephant, diplodocus, whatever metaphor you want to use, in the room, but it's also our lifestyle. We also have this expectation of maintaining a certain kind of lifestyle. I want to have, this kind of yard. I want to live near this thing. I want to live in Old Town or whatever, and we might need to seriously modify some of those expectations. It's not just about growth. It's not just about the 80,000 people that are coming up I-25 that are going to live here and set up a new house. It's about what we're doing here now and kind of the expectation we have for a lifestyle in Fort Collins. I don't think any of us want to sacrifice the friendliness or the fact that we have these green spaces, but there are other aspects, I think, of our lives that we might need to modify.
I mean, the question, Elizabeth, excuse me. Melissa, I'm sorry. Melissa brought up, is the science there? In other words, the question is, how big can we get? And when do we hit some sort of a tipping point in terms of how big to get to, that balance between this quote unquote quality of life and what's the environment handling? What can it, do we know? Do we have any idea what we can handle? What is our projection for growth? What are we going to cut it off at 210, or what's the, what do we know about?
When
that?
do the gates shut?
Yeah, when do you shut the gates? Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't mean. I'm trying to just in terms of the conversation. I think the question, the gorilla in the room is really, when does growth have to stop in order to maintain the quality of life that we all want, or is technology just going to take over? Are we just going to be able to sort of spiral and grow crops in the middle of Fort Collins and not have to worry about rural communities and, waste, everything will be 100%? Where are we going? What's the vision going ahead? In order to plan, we have to vision the future. So what are the innovations that have to happen in order for you guys to all feel like you have the quality of life you want? I didn't mean to take that over. It just sort of came out.
I mean, I guess, so I definitely don't have an answer to all of that. But what I would like to say is that I feel like that question and is relevant sort of globally, right? At a global scale. Like this is something as conservationists or people that care about biodiversity and human well-being, I mean, this is something we're asking across the globe, right?
Yeah.
And we haven't really been able to answer that question, I don't think, very accurately, even though people have been working on this for decades, right? Like we've sort of repeatedly sort of gotten it wrong, I guess. But I guess the point I'd like to make is that I think it's not just about just adding numbers of people. So it's not just about more bodies, and we see this globally. It's about how we're using resources. And several of these folks have already spoken to that. But I really, like the way that we use resources is really unequal across the globe, right? And so I think the biggest potential is for us to reduce consumption, reduce waste, right? And that's something that we can do here, each as individuals and as a community. So given that some growth is inevitable, right, and we have these shifting baselines, I think that's something that we can work on, that we can do.
Yeah, great,
Yeah.
great. Anybody else want to add to that? I have a question over here. Hold on.
That was a great response. John Grant. In the spirit of more radical thinking, I would like to paraphrase loosely the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change Research in Germany, who wrote a book a couple of years ago, and I have not been able to find an English translation. So the loose English translation is self-immolation. And the prescription for the United States is to prepare to accommodate, according to his arithmetic, 50 million climate refugees during the 20 years beginning in 2020. That's 3 million per year. Or, alternatively, support, no, don't build a wall, send a Western Union check to their home countries to support these accumulating 50 million people, because that's our fair share, the United States' fair share of the excess carbon in the atmosphere. So the question is, what are radical, nonlinear proposals for dealing with these issues? Because believe me, I've got friends who are going to be moving toward Fort Collins with big paychecks, and they're going to buy their way into this utopia that we're building here, because they're going to be pushed out of South Florida, they're going to be pushed out of South Texas, and so forth. Radical envisioning.
You're speaking my language. I'm not kidding. And that's a great quote. And I think that, and that's not even counting the internal refugees, like you alluded to right there. That's 50 million international refugees, not counting all the communities from all the coastlines that are going to get dumped on and flooded. And so I think you're right. I think the types of radical things that we would need to think about are the things that are really going to cut into some kind of cultural things that we're not willing to give up. Maybe you could say a citywide tax on meat. Maybe you, like in terms of making big impacts to carbon, and both in terms of managed land. And I eat meat. I don't want to do that per se, but it would make a huge impact. Managing our food system in a different way is going to make a huge impact. I don't think sending checks to a community that's under whatever, by what time a meter of water is going to do anything. And so I think it's thinking radically about the vast numbers of people that are going to see the Front Range as a very desirable place to live, aside from the high temperatures and wildfire and water scarcity. I think that it's certainly better than if your house is underwater. And so I think you're right. But the radical changes that are going to need to take place are going to be, maybe you can't drive inside the city. And we have to just say, if we said you can't drive in the city, what would you do? What would we do? Let's figure the problem out. But you say you can't drive in the city, and that would reduce some impacts. You have to say density has to increase in terms of who's living per square foot. I mean, it could get to it's going to get bad in some places, and maybe we have to proactively say you have to have more people living per unit area. I don't know. I'm not saying this is what I want. I'm just saying that these are the types of things where you have to almost make it, in some ways, you'd have to make the community not seem, well, it won't be as desirable as other places if we start to say we need to rein in how we live. And all of a sudden, some of those places that people are coming from are going to say, well, you have to have a lot more responsibility there. Maybe we don't want to live there, because it's coping and dealing with it and living that way is going to require sacrifice. And I think that's also going to indicate that maybe some of those people don't want to move here. Sorry.
Okay, no, great. Tim?
I think just to build on that real quickly, I think it's incredibly important, and I can't speak to the influx of people that we're going to get because of the effects of climate change, but I think doing what we can at this immediate point in time to mitigate that to the best of our ability. And one of those pieces is sharing our stories with areas where this conversation is not happening, right? Our university, we're so lucky to be a part of that community, to have that in the city of Fort Collins for its sustainability ranking. There are places in the United States and universities where climate change is still not an agreeable topic of conversation. And so it's our responsibility as CSU, we partner directly with the University of Houston. That's one of those areas where we're engaging and we're trying to share all of these little individual wins, these details that we're getting into tonight that are incredible. And those are the parts of sustainability that move it forward for a future city that can function. And we need to be able to share that story with these other areas and components who are not jumping in at this point in time for creating a sustainable United States of America or globe of the future on a small scale, a community scale.
Okay, question over here.
Hi, I'm Peter Erickson. I'm actually an assistant professor of German in the College of Liberal Arts here at CSU. And I wanted to ask about density again. And my question is, how much denser are we going to have to get? How much density can Fort Collins handle? How does density play a role in discussions of sustainability looking out over several decades? And what kinds of conversations around density do we need to start to have in order to prepare ourselves for that future? And I think in terms of sustainability, I'm especially interested in this question of sprawl and to what extent through Fort Collins making choices for more density, we can prevent some of the sprawl, say, up Poudre Canyon or further north from us.
Okay. Density. Liba? Okay.
I'll just, so I can just speak to one aspect, I think, or one dimension of that question, then others pitch in. But one thing that I've worked on in collaboration with lots of others, including Lindsay, is this idea of how can we think about the configuration of growth? So rather than thinking about it in terms of, so you could have the same density, for example, of homes on a landscape, but there's different ways to configure those homes. So either sort of sprawled and low density development across the landscape, or perhaps clustered in a small area in ways to deliberately protect then the remaining landscape for ecological or agricultural values of that land. And so that's something that we've been exploring through science and also interactions with communities around this topic. And we do find, what I can speak to most directly from sort of a biodiversity standpoint, that clustering homes at the same or even higher densities in a particular parcel provides much greater benefits for high quality habitat, for example, for wildlife, for plants and wildlife. And there's also good evidence from other people's work that it reduces risk from wildfire and the costs of wildfire, and it reduces the costs of infrastructure. So I think thinking about the configuration of development is perhaps as important as thinking about density in some ways.
So the answer is more. And I think it's just starting next week. We're going to be having visioning discussions as a community, and these types of issues are going to come up. So I want you all to think about fcgov.com/cityplan. I want you to sign up for their email list, because there are going to be numerous events for us to weigh in on these types of particular issues. We've seen more multifamily developments than we ever have in the past. And so that's absolutely happening. And yet it's also a key area of tension in our community, right? How many of you all live in a neighborhood where an apartment complex has come up against your neighborhood? And how many folks have been super excited about that? I used to work in development review. Not many, right? And so we've got these real tensions that we need to work out, because of course we need more density in order to reach our big goals, right? And when we start to operationalize that on the ground, it's not as pretty, right? So we've got a lot of work to do in this space. And if I may, just really quickly, I want to go back to the radical question, because one thing I think about all the time is, wouldn't it be radical if we could make it really positive? Right? How do we really empower people to do the right thing? I had a person ask me, who I absolutely adore, at the city plan kickoff where almost 500 people attended, how do you pick your head off the pillow every morning with what you're working on, right? And I said, maybe it's because I get to be inspired every day by all the other cities that I get to work with. I'm working with 10 other cities across the country, like Flagstaff and others, that aren't necessarily in a bastion of progressiveness, if you will. But we're all working on marketing campaigns around how people can take easy, simple actions that make a difference. And so one of the things that I would challenge everybody around is, how do we make it positive? Because doom and gloom, that only lasts so long for inspiring folks, right? So that would be my radical notion, too.
Question.
Thanks for that comment, Lindsay, and that actually pivots right into my shameless plug. I work at Fort Collins Utilities, and the program that I'm working on is primarily around choice. I think about the individual things that we can do within our community to make that action, or to take that action that rolls up into the climate action plan. Think about all those climate refugees, and that starts to become an insurmountable problem, or it starts to create that idea of what is my role in this, and what can I do as an individual? And so the program that I'm working on is building energy scoring, which allows people to make that choice on whether or not to buy a particular home or to rent a particular office space. And so all of these people that are coming into the community, one of the first questions that they may consider is, what is the utility use in that building? What is the operating cost of that building? And is that something that, A, I can afford, or maybe I'm sustainability minded and that's not the particular place that I would like to occupy? And so I really encourage you to look on our website. It's the Building Energy Scoring website, and join the conversation around how those choices can start to help inform you as an individual and how you can contribute to the climate action plan.
Okay. Question. Somebody had a hand up. Okay. Oh, here we go.
My name is Kay. I'm an undergrad at CSU. I'm actually undeclared, but I'm taking Foundations of Sustainability class, which I see my professor. But I guess my question is, I'm really interested in environmental justice. And when we are talking about natural resources in land use planning, are we considering cultural perspectives of history of land rights when we think about how we're going to use land that is important to indigenous peoples in this country?
Good question. Okay, who's going to tackle that one?
I'll say, so one of the other networks that I'm fortunate enough to be a part of is called USDN. It's the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And this is 170 plus communities across the country that are all working on sustainability goals similar to Fort Collins. And I would say that how we are addressing equity and inclusion and thinking about it, whether you're calling it environmental justice or you're calling it social sustainability, is just one of the biggest questions that's on everybody's mind right now. And I've had a chance to interact with some of the folks that are at the leading edge of this. Portland, Oregon comes to mind. And what they always say to us is that even the folks that are on the leading edge are just at the very beginning of their journey in this space. So I think the honest answer is that this is a space that there's a lot more focus on, and we have a lot of work to do as well.
Just to chime in really quick. This is an area that I'm not an expert in, but it's an area that I'm very interested in. And I found that everybody who wants to learn about this, which you're in a very good position to learn about this, is that you can't learn enough and you can't read enough. And every time you learn something more about this, it gets more complicated. And so I think if you're interested in this, dive deeply and get interested in that complexity, because it's, as soon as you think you've figured out the answer to something, you'll realize that that's not the answer and that there's another layer. And so I think that it's fantastic that you're interested in, and keep going for it, and just keep diving in.
One of the things you hear a lot about is, our problem is a Western problem. We're Western cities. And one of the things that we face is this question we get at the university about sustaining rural communities. So when you're planning Fort Collins or you're living along the Front Range, do you guys think about that? Like, do you want to support rural communities, and why? I mean, why would you do that? Just because they want to be supported, or what? Is there a value, or?
Nah.
No, I mean, that's so what about that? Sustaining those rural communities. You've heard that before, haven't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's such a, I'm a rural girl. It's the biggest community I've ever lived in. My town tipped over 2,000 a couple of years ago. I don't think my husband's ever will. He's a Youper. I lived in Alaska for 7 Youpers. You know what they say about outgoing Youpers? Yeah, he's looking at your shoes. Lived in Alaska for 7 years, right? And I also with the, you like that, Kevin? With the communities that I get to work with in Colorado, their quality of life is just as important to them, and they're equally concerned right now. When you look at that snowpack map, we're in a very fortunate situation here in our watershed, but when I talk to the folks that are down in San Miguel County, boy, they are stressed out, right? And I had a chance to talk with a county commissioner from Summit County just recently, and she was saying that their lakes that they would skate on over Christmas weren't frozen at the end of January. And so I think that we've got some really interesting things, especially as in Colorado, with our love for the outdoors and recreation, and those are the communities that are supporting a lot of the things we love. So rural communities are awesome.
Okay.
That's what I would say.
All right, Liba.
I'll just, add to that and just say, again, from a sort of a biodiversity perspective, often private lands are the most biologically productive. So these are the places that have the most life, like the richest biological communities, in part because they've been often very well stewarded by private landowners, and also because much of our public land tends to be at higher elevations or just in certain sort of habitat types. And you can see that here in Colorado, right? The distribution of public and private land is sort of unequal across the state. And so I think working hard to sustain rural communities, both because we value their well-being and the sort of heritage that they bring and have sustained over time, but also because they are working hard to preserve this sort of rich lands, rich biodiversity for all of us. So we all benefit from their stewardship that they've been practicing over the last hundreds of years. So.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Patrick.
Just one quick thing. I had no idea that I would have an opportunity to talk about my most of the time research, which is how people manage the land surface and how that affects evaporation and how that might flow as rainfall somewhere else. And so it turns out that in a lot of parts of lots of the world, it really does matter what people are doing to the land surface for the atmospheric water cycle. And so aside from all of the absolutely important considerations of just kind of human well-being and just people living where they want to live, we also depend on rural communities for their continued management of the land in a way that's going to sustain us in terms of the hydrologic cycle, in terms of what we eat, all of those things. So we have a very clear self-interest also. People who live in towns and cities have a very clear self-interest in also supporting rural communities.
Yeah, Eleanor again. I'm going to bring you back to the growth word that I'm not going to let you off on that yet. It seems to me that there's a difference. Growth is going to happen, but are we encouraging growth? Are we helping to bring growth? I notice CSU is advertising all the time, and they keep growing. Is there going to be a point which CSU is not going to grow? because I don't know, maybe we just grow forever at CSU, but I think that's one of the major growth factors in our community.
Okay.
I wish I could turn the mic over to Tony Frank at this point.
No, oh, no, you don't.
I really don't.
You better
I'll
answer.
do my best to answer it. We are growing, and there is not, as far as I know, a point in the near future where we are going to stop student population. We are building residence halls. We're building apartment complexes with the idea that we will have more students at CSU. I don't know where that threshold lies. When we have the conversation of enough is enough, our campus is going to start to cap the student population and then make it more challenging, right? Everything else, cost could potentially go up in the future. And you see it in some of the institutions that have done this, the difficulty to get into the institution. And that changes, I think, some of our mission and values as a land-grant institution, as a public research institution. And so growth really has been a part of CSU's story, and I don't know where that's going to end in the near future.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, gang, we're getting toward the end, so why don't we give our panel a big hand for the work they did tonight?